Right, comrades, who here can sing? Who can sing? Put your hands up. Come on, this is pathetic. Right, I'll be looking for, I hope you've all got a copy of the important document which was handed out to you at the door by courtesy of the Central Committee, and I hope you'll all read it carefully, so I've been calling on those people that put their hands up later. Now, this is a sacrificial meeting, obviously, and I'm very, very surprised to see so many people here. I thought there would be just a few. It's an idea that John Rees had to make things awkward for me, to have a meeting about Maxwell, working for Maxwell, and I can't imagine why all of you have come here. I'm really quite incredible. I'm sure you've all come to the wrong meeting. And I think maybe one of the reasons that you've come is that you're under the illusion that there might be some laughter here tonight, that the whole idea of Maxwell is a bit of a joke. And I want to disabuse you of that straight away. For those of us who work for Maxwell, he wasn't a joke at all. And Black Friday, as we still remember it, people like to say, where were you when Kennedy was assassinated and things of that kind? Where were you when Maxwell took over the Daily Mirror? I was hunched over the radio at 8 o'clock in the morning, listening to the early news bulletin that Maxwell had taken over the Daily Mirror, the worst news I think I'd ever heard up to that time in the whole of my life, as far as my own life was concerned. Maxwell was to take over the Daily Mirror, and it was extremely grim. We knew it was grim. One reason we knew it was grim is that we'd been told it was going to be grim by Joe Haynes, who was the leader writer for the Daily Mirror, and who the day before, on July the 12th, 1984, at a great big meeting of the National Union of Journalists, held in one of the upper rooms of the Daily Mirror, had told us all, after somebody had said, well, what about this Maxwell? Is he so bad? Is it such a bad thing that he should take over the Daily Mirror? At which Joe Haynes, fulminating, furious, and this chap knows his stuff, by the way, because he was former press officer for Harold Wilson, got up and announced as follows, and we all took it down then, we've all got it forged on our memory: Maxwell is a crook and a monster, and I can prove it. Now, that wasn't a particularly remarkable thing to have to prove, because anybody who'd read anything about Maxwell at all could prove it very easily. For instance, in 1971 there was published a report by Board of Trade or Department of Trade inspectors into the takeover of Maxwell's company Pergamon by Lisco, an American company. That is a great catalogue of lying and cheating, that report by the Department of Trade inspectors, which ends with a famous sentence, which I'll read out right away. We regret having to conclude that Mr. Maxwell is not, in our opinion, a person who can be relied on to exercise proper stewardship of a public company. Now, you would have thought that that was a reasonable thing to conclude from that Mr. Maxwell, if that's what the Department of Trade said, after a long investigation, might be in some way banned from exercising public stewardship of a public company. And certainly in the years following the report, in 1971, Maxwell definitely faded into the background in British public life. 1971, I remind you, the early 1970s were years in which our side was winning and the other side was losing. And the other side, as it was losing, became less and less confident about how it should proceed. It's those early years, the 1970s, and its lack of confidence in which Maxwell fades into the background. They were embarrassed by liars and cheats. They didn't want crooks. They didn't want someone who had said that Pergamon Press was worth £500,000 when in fact it was worth at most 50,000, and one of the inspectors actually concluded that it was worth nothing whatsoever. £500,000 may not sound much to you today, but it was very, very much more than that in 1971. They didn't want people who lied by 500 times as to the value of their company. They wanted certain rules for their stock exchange operation. You can't run a stock exchange without rules, and they wanted to maintain those rules. And therefore, if some upstart, particularly if he was born abroad, and particularly if he happened to be Jewish, came along and broke the rules, then they vented their anger upon that upstart and made sure that he declined and went into the sidelines of British public life. And that's what happened as Maxwell tried to regain his foothold on the printing industry in the early and middle 1970s. But in the late 1970s, if you recall, the situation changed. The ebb and flow of the class struggle changed. The tremendous confidence of the early 1970s changed to a lack of confidence as the Labour government, in attack on the working class movement, rendered it much more impotent than it had been in the early 1970s. And in that period, rather strange things started to happen in British industry. In 1981, a very strange thing happened. The man who, it was said, by the government itself, by the spokespeople for the class itself, could not be relied on to exercise stewardship over a public company, became chairman of the British Public Printing Company in the country. He became chairman of the British Printing Corporation, an old-fashioned, rotten, defeated management, accepted Maxwell first as chief executive and deputy chairman, and then as chairman of the British Printing Corporation. He became chairman of that company. Why? Had he somehow proved that he was not a crook? No, everybody knew that he was still a crook. Had he somehow proved that he was not a monster? No, everybody knew that he was still a monster. But the question of crookedness and monstership, if you like, were no longer central to the question of how the class imagined the people that they wanted to run their industries in the early 1980s. Crookedness, monstership, we could put them on one side. What was required was somebody who could come and bash the unions, because the unions were the issue for the class at that time. And therefore, if a man was a crook or a monster, it didn't matter so much. The question which was raised in people's minds was, is this a man that can bash the unions? If he's a man who bashed the unions, then we won't refer to that Department of Trade report in 1971. We won't refer to the fact that he's a well-known liar and cheat, an instinctive liar and cheat, a man who lies instinctively before he tells the truth, just in case the truth might be some damage. A man who cheats automatically rather than pays up what, even if it's less than what he ought to pay, will pay more in order that he may be seen to be a cheat. We don't mind about that. We don't mind anymore, because the central question is, can he bash the unions? Now, in this print industry, newspaper industry, whatever you want to call it, in this industry, when people talk about the 1980s and how the print unions were bashed, they refer, of course, and they're right to refer to it, to the great attack made by Eddie Shah. He was the corporal, do you remember, who was sent in front, like in the old things we were taught in national service in the army. Through that gap, corporal, I'm close behind. That was the cry that went up in the ruling class to Eddie Shah. Get through that gap and see if you can smash the unions. And people remember Shah, the messenger dispute, the Today newspaper, and of course they remember Rupert Murdoch and the attack on the print unions, the move to Wapping, the open and blatant attack on the trade unions which took place in 1985 and 1986, headed by Murdoch. I think that people who highlight these matters do little credit to Robert Maxwell, because it was Robert Maxwell who started this operation. And he started it in the British Printing Corporation, which was then, as I say, the biggest printing corporation company in the country. And in a matter of months, literally in a matter of months, holding high the banner of trade unionism, which was his particular subtlety, holding high the banner of trade unionism, he reduced a staff of about 6,500 workers in the British Printing Corporation by 2,500. That is, he took 40% of the workers' jobs out without really a single protest or a single strike. Now, that was an achievement which was greeted with tremendous applause from every area of the ruling class. The National Westminster Bank had orgasms of delight as they watched the crook and the monster and the man who was unfit to exercise stewardship over a public company, exercising his stewardship over a public company in such a way that masses of workers were sacked and the print unions in the biggest print company in the country were smashed to smithereens. They were delighted at this sight. They were prepared to overlook everything about Maxwell as he proceeded. And of course he did proceed. He went on to take other companies over. He took over the great big printing operation of Oddham's. By the time he took over the Daily Mirror, and this is something that people forget, he was effectively one of the biggest printing magnates in Europe. He was certainly one of the biggest printing magnates in Britain, the biggest printing magnate in Britain, and one of the biggest printing magnates. He controlled the print industry in this country before he even touched the Daily Mirror. And he controlled it with the enthusiastic support, not just of finance capital, if you like, the banks, but also not of the class itself, and even of the side of the class itself which dealt with propaganda, journalism, British Broadcasting Corporation. There were no real attacks. Of course, he was very good at issuing the libel writ, but in those early years, of course, there could have been much sharper attacks, but there weren't, because they were approving exactly what he was doing in the British Printing Corporation and in the other print unions which he took over. So let's go back to that Black Friday in July 1984. I just want to describe what it was like to work at the Daily Mirror in the early 1980s. I went to work there about 6 months after the Tory government was elected first in 1979. And it was a wonderful place to work, the Daily Mirror, a wonderful place. The best thing about it was that the unions were so magnificently strong. It was quite impossible for management to move a single inch. The National Union of Journalists operated entirely on across-the-board increases. All the salaries were bunched. There was very, very little merit money. The money was very good. Everybody felt that they were part of a collective, operating as part of a collective, not just journalistically. Of course, the Daily Mirror was very, very much better then than it is now in every sense. But the journalist side, not so important. The side of working in a place where there was this feeling of the collective, not just among the journalists, but also, of course, among the print workers, it was a wonderful place to work. Was it true, as we were told, day in, day out, by anxious editors, that the strength of the unions had somehow affected the editorial content of the Daily Mirror, that the freedom of the editors and the owners and the people who owned the Daily Mirror was somehow circumscribed by the way in which the unions worked? That wasn't true at all. There was no sign of it. I never, in the whole 4 or 5 years that I worked there, heard a single case of the trade unions affecting the judgment, especially when the judgment was good, the judgment of the editor. Perhaps that's a bad thing for the freedom of the press, but certainly the idea that somehow or other they were held back, that they were restricted by union power in those early years, or at any other time that I've ever been in a place where there have been strong unions in a workplace, in a newspaper workplace, was simply the opposite of the truth. It was a very free, contented and happy place to work. Lots of slush, of course, far too much slush, particularly on the top side of management and the like, but in general, a place that was a very good place to work, which produced a large number of newspapers and sold a large number of newspapers without causing really any great angst or unpleasantness among the people who worked there. Now, that is the situation that existed when Maxwell came there, and of course, he set himself to destroy it. Just one other example, which I should have mentioned, an example of what I mean. In the early months of the miners' strike, which started in March 1984, in the early months of the miners' strike, the canteen of the Daily Mirror was told by the print unions that any miner or any member of any miner's family, anybody who had any relation to any miner at all, anyone who came anywhere at all collecting money for the miners, anyone who said they didn't have to prove anything, that they were in favor of the miners, got free food in the canteen. And the canteen was one of the most wonderful places to be during that period. You could go down any time and there would be lots and lots of miners' families, people who'd come down from Yorkshire, from Durham, from Lancashire, from Scotland, who'd come down there to collect money for the mine. They'd come straight there, fed there every day, then they realised what was going on there. They fed perhaps 4 or 5 times, 6 or 7 times a day, and all that money, which was notched up to the print unions, they paid for that. I think of that when people say the dark days of the print unions, those print union workers with 2 country cottages. I always used to say, well, why shouldn't they have 2 country cottages? That's 3 as far as I'm concerned, because when the miners were in struggle, they were supported by the workers there. That was an example of that atmosphere. Now, the Mirror was owned at that time by a company called Reed International, a great big multinational company, which had no control over the editorial content of the Daily Mirror whatsoever. I mean, people used to use it as a wonderful example of the freedom of the press. They would say, here's this great big corporation led by a man called Lord Jarrett, Sir Alex Jarrett as he was then, who votes Labour, who isn't interested at all in the editorial content of the Daily Mirror. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that a wonderful way in which freedom of the press works under capitalism? Now, the Reed Corporation, IPC, the subsidiary of the Reed Corporation that owned the Daily Mirror at that time, hated owning the Daily Mirror. They were detested it. First of all, it didn't produce enough profit to give them lots of dividends. It produced a profit. I mean, even in the so-called worst year, that is the best year from our point of view, because we've always got to put it the other way round. Even in the best year from our point of view, when they did the worst, they still made profits, but they never made profits which could fatten up the dividends, which made it worthwhile to own a product of that kind. So Reed detested it, and they announced simply that they were going to sell it. They'd had enough, the unions were too strong, they were getting out. But because, of course, they had capitalist principles, you know what those are, capitalist principles, that is the idea in their heads, that idea's always in their heads, of lots and lots of people having a slice of the cake. Here was a nice big cake that they were going to distribute to the whole of the nation. They were going to, anybody who could who could stump up a few pounds could buy a share in the Daily Mirror. And what they said from the very start was, we're going to have a newspaper which is owned by lots and lots and lots of people, with a very nice chap called Thornton, who we've got from some building society who cares about the homeless. This little chap came in with his spectacles and lectures us on the homeless, how terrible it was that there were homeless people, how he hoped the newspaper would do something about the homeless. I remember him talking to John Pilder, saying we want a whole series on the homeless. I remember John saying, yes, that would be a very good idea. Yes, Clive, wonderful. So little Thornton came in, and he was going to be the chair, and there were going to be lots and lots of people who were going to own lots of things. One thing they weren't going to do, and they gave their word, and I'm sure you know that their word is their bond. That is something which is written up over the stock exchange, actually written up in Latin over the stock exchange. Our word is our bond. When we say something, you know that we mean it. And one thing we're not going to do in any circumstances whatsoever, we're not going to sell the Daily Mirror to a single owner. Now, I remember in the National Union of Journalists, against my advice, as a matter of fact, because I don't think unions should own anything, but the National Union of Journalists, so strong and confident were they, said, well, why can't we buy the Daily Mirror? They went down there, they went down to the City of London, and they borrowed it, so immediately got about 50 people who were always willing to lend money. Yes, yes, we'll lend you lots of money, investors, you know, merchant venturers and so on. We'll lend money to the National Union of Journalists to buy the Daily Mirror. So they sent a delegation to see Sir Alex Jarrett and said, can we buy the Daily Mirror? We work there. We have some relationship with it. May we buy it? Oh no, my word is my bond. My word is my bond. Mea verba est, whatever the Latin for bond is. And I'm on no account whatsoever would we dream of breaking our word. You're a multiple ownership. You're lots of workers. You're a single union. We don't like the idea of a single union controlling the Daily Mirror. So go away, and we're going to stick to our word, and our word is our bond. We are not going to have any sole owner, unless, of course, he's a crook or a monster. There's that one exception. If you can find a crook and a monster, then we might think again. And here's Maxwell with 100 million, which was about half what the Daily Mirror was worth at that time. It was about what the building was worth at that particular time. Comes up with 100 million, and like a flash, quick as a flash, their word is their bond is up the chimney, and the man unfit to run a public company is fit now to run the company which sells the papers, which sell more newspapers than any other group in the country at that time. They just changed their line, broke their word, openly broke their word, snivelled and grovelled away as they turned their attention to the money which Maxwell had provided. And so we were faced then with Robert Maxwell as the proprietor of the Daily Mirror. Now, just one or two questions I want to ask. I don't suppose many people here will have much difficulty in answering them, but since they are the myths that spread around, let's deal with them right away. The first is, Was Maxwell a good newspaper man? Did he have a sense of news? Did he have an interest in what was published in his newspaper just for what they said? Did he know what a scoop was? Actually, he knew all the jargon, Maxwell, but he always got the jargon wrong. He always said a scoop was something else. A scoop was a sort of line on a page. Every single piece of jargon which was put to him was always the opposite of what he thought it was. So he didn't even know what the words meant, as a matter of fact. But even assuming that he knew what the words meant, was he a good newspaper man? Now, the truth of the matter is that the idea that Maxwell had of a good newspaper was a newspaper which published a lot of news about Maxwell. That was the central principle of his journalistic technique. That if it was about him or anybody he knew, and he knew quite a lot of people, then it was a good story. If it wasn't about him, it wasn't a good story, and he passed the orders down. And so the Daily Mirror became what everybody knew it became, the Daily Maxwell. It became a story, a series of stories about Daily Maxwell. Now, Roy Greenslade, who wrote really, I think, a very funny book about Maxwell, I don't know if you've read his book. If you haven't, you'll certainly enjoy it. This is a laugh from start to finish. I'll just give you a little bit of an example. He says, he rings up from Israel one day, Greenslade. "Have you got a splash?" He asked one day on the phone from Israel. "I have an exclusive for you." My heart sank at such moments because they were usually the start of a row. He had no idea about the content of the Daily Mirror and tended to refer to my guidance in these matters as defiance. "What is it, Bob?" I asked. He noted my lack of enthusiasm. "I'll only give it to you if you splash it." Now, that was a word he did know, because that was front page stuff. You know, like the front page picture of him and Prince Charles, which there's nothing else on the front page, Maxwell and Prince Charles. That's a splash, he knew that. "I'll only give it to you if you splash it." I desperately wanted to say, "In that case, don't tell me." It would have been much better for Roy Greenslade if he'd said that a little more often. But I was polite enough to inquire what it was all about. Now that's the first, now you see, coming on to some big news here. "I have just bought both of Jerusalem's football teams," he said, making it sound as if he'd taken an option on the crown jewels. I was so glad he could not see my face as I replied with some sincerity, "Wow, Bob, that's amazing." One thing Maxwell was never good at was satire. He never... "Right," said Maxwell, "so it's the splash." "I don't think so, Bob. It isn't, in fairness, the greatest story in Britain." "Fuck you!" he shouted. "Why are you always arguing with me? I'll go and give this exclusive to one of your rivals." That terrible threat, I don't think was ever carried out, and if it was carried out, it certainly did. The news item didn't appear, I don't think, in any single British newspaper, although it did appear, unfortunately, in the Daily Mirror. Now, Maxwell was interested in stories about himself, particularly, wanted stories about himself, but also interested in stories about his friends. And I'll just record to you some of his friends here. It's very important because they sort of haven't been so prominent in their friendship over the last few months. Lord Young, the most odious of all Thatcher's ministers, was his greatest companion. He was hardly ever out of the building, Lord Young. I remember when John Pilger wrote an article about unemployment, and Maxwell rang up the editor and said, "I'm going to show this article to my friend Young. He knows all about employment." Pilger protested, but they showed it to him anyway, and then he wrote a comment about Pilger's article. That was the sort of thing that was going on. Lord King, the chairman of British Airways, another great union buster extraordinary, Lord King. He was hardly ever out of Maxwell's lunch table. Gerald Ronson, the man who was involved in the Guinness affair, in my belief, involved Maxwell also in the Guinness affair. He was a great friend of Maxwell's. Greenslade records that when Ronson was finally convicted with three others on the Guinness affair, Maxwell rang up and said, "I don't mind you putting in the others, but don't put in Ronson's name." So what was going to appear was that 4 people were convicted, and here are 3 names. That was the way he saw news. Lord Forty, the catering king, was a great friend of Maxwell's. Anything that affected Lord Forty was something that was immediately taken up by Maxwell. I remember a story when Lorman Lamont was canoodling with Lord Forty's daughter one evening, and the daughter's lover arrived, and there was a fight, and Norman Lamont was out in the street with an enormous black eye, stumbling about, and numbers of people, including the lover, made sure that this was reported to the newspapers. And when it came to the Daily Mirror that Norman Lamont might be made a fool of in the Daily Mirror, Maxwell called up the head of the gossip column at the time and said, "I want you to report that a vile rumour is circulating about Norman Lamont, which is entirely untrue." This did appear in the Daily Mirror. The fact that it appeared in all the other papers, the opposite of it, as being something that was perfectly true, was rather embarrassing. However, he didn't always get his own way. I devised a way of, whenever I was writing about a friend of Maxwell's, of trying to get round it in this way. I'll just tell you this little story. A chap came to see me who was a gamekeeper for Rocco Forty, and Rocco Forty owns half of Surrey, like most of these people do, and they have huge estates, and they shoot grouse on these estates. And the gamekeeper came to me and said that he kept a huge gymnasium full of grouse, which he was instructed to feed very badly and to starve and make them ill, so that when his friends came down to shoot the grouse, and the grouse were beaten out of the thing, they could hardly fly, so that they would be easily shot. This is the way. This is important. These are important people we're talking about, by the way. Lord Forty owns hotels up and down the country, controls pretty well the entire production of catering and British food in this country, and he's telling his gamekeeper, "Starve the grouse." So he had these pictures of these starved grouse in great sort of rows and rows of them dying on the floor there. And then he said when they died, he sold them into his own food chain, so that people were getting these disgusting grouse, dying of all kinds of awful diseases, in his own food chain. So it's quite a good story. I think you'll agree. It's quite a good story. I mean, we were very glad to see the gamekeeper on that occasion, and we greeted him with a lot of enthusiasm. And says, however, as I see Lord Forty, bell rings, bing, bing, bing. So I go to the editor, I say, we've got this wonderful story, we've got the affidavit, we want to put it to Lord Forty, right? To Rocco Forty and to the Forty organisation that this goes on, right? So we'll do that. So he said, the editor said, yes, I see, I've got the affidavit, very good story and so on. So you go upstairs and you ring up, is that the Forty organisation? We understand, etc., etc., etc. Send a fax so that it's absolutely clear. And I went straight down to the editor's office and sat there waiting. And it took about 15 minutes. Hello? Alford's got some rubbish about my friend Forty. But on that occasion, the editor was able to say, yes, a tremendous story it is too, Bob. We've got the affidavits, we've got the pictures of the dying grouse. It's absolutely wonderful, we'll be able to publish it. Noise slightly like a deflated elephant takes place, and we got that story in. Now, the Daily Maxwell was a complete and utter disaster for those who think that he had some technique, some ability. Anyone who thinks that should look at the figures. In the period, in the first 12 or 14 months that he was in control of the Daily Mirror, from 1984 July till September 1985, the Daily Mirror lost 500,000 copies, the biggest slump in newspaper circulation in the entire history of the newspaper industry, by 100%. There's never been a time when so many people have said, and thank goodness, it shows really that on the whole, given the people in this country, the Daily Mirror people are probably the people who buy the Daily Mirror, probably the best. No, not another picture of Maxwell. Not another picture of Maxwell. And he wasn't just his private enterprise Tory friends, but Maxwell and the great dictators of Eastern Europe. Here's a little piece here. Champagne but speeches. This was the spread on the day the miners' strike ended. What was the priority in the Daily Mirror? I dined at the court of a modest communist king last week. This is by a very good reporter called Anton Antonovic, who was plucked out of the Daily Mirror, whisked over to Bulgaria in order to have dinner with the bureaucratic dictator Zhivkov there, and to say that he was the most wonderful man who'd ever lived. Now that word modest, Anton, I saw him yesterday and he explained to me, I said, what about this piece? Look at it again, you know, I mean really, honestly. He says, well, I did it satirically. I dined at the court of a communist king. And he puts in the word modest. There's Maxwell. I want to see that piece about my friend Zhivkov. Anyway, there's the whole piece about difficult, and people can't stand that kind of thing. They don't buy the Daily Mirror to read about Bulgarian dictators and what wonderful businessmen are and how beautiful their daughters are. That's not why they buy the Daily Mirror. Whatever other reason they buy it, they don't buy it for that. And therefore they left in droves. This enormous decline took place in the circulation at that time. And after a bit, working there, I'll just describe it like this. It was an astonishing spectacle, an amazing thing to go in every day and work together with thousands of people. I mean, there are 2,000 people in that Mirror building in Holborn there alone. Work together in circumstances in which everybody you were working with were really people of considerable ability. There were writers of considerable ability. There were sub-editors of considerable ability. There were people who knew how to put a page together in a trice. Incredible abilities that they had. There were people then downstairs who knew how to print the paper, who understood all the different techniques of printing, who knew what to happen when one of the machines went wrong. There were people outside the building who knew how to distribute the paper, how to sell the paper. All these people were working in an enterprise to which they were contributing some initiative and some talent. And all of them, in a matter of a year or two, became entirely dominated by a man who had no recognizable talent whatsoever. No ability, couldn't read. Did you know that? Couldn't read. I mean, the publisher who couldn't read is the classic caricature of capitalism. When you say, you give him a memo, I can't read that one, underline the bits, the 3 words I need to know. This was the man who was at the top, and in whom all these thousands of people that had all this ability, who held... in whom he held these people in his hand. They all looked upwards. People who before had looked across and argued and debated and questioned and criticized, now did none of those things whatsoever. Simply looked upwards all the time, so that the dominating theme of the capitalist hierarchy, the awful business of looking up all the time and looking up to something which had nothing to look up to, no ability to accept his power, that was the situation that existed in the Daily Mirror. It was a kind of caricature of all the things that are terrible about a capitalist society. And of course, he set his mind, as he was wrecking the Daily Mirror editorially, so he set his mind at the same time to do the thing that he was put in to do and that he was supported in doing, that is, to bust the unions. He bust the NUJ in the Christmas of 1985. I still remember the meeting, the huge meeting that we had there, in which some of us called there for strike action. In fact, 3 times we had resolutions there for strikes, all of them defeated. And coming in, of course, he always did this at the times. He was very good at this. This was the one thing he was good at, in between Christmas and New Year. Coming into the office on 28th of December 1985 and seeing 15, 20 sub-editors, people of great experience and ability, in the corridor looking for the father of the chapel with tears running down their faces, their lives ruined, sacked, accepted by the unions, compulsory redundant. The NUJ was smashed. More subtly, he destroyed the print unions by picking out the militants, offering them big redundancy pay, sending them off. People who were tired and fed up and didn't want a battle and saw other people losing battles and saw the sort of things that were developing at Wapping and the like, and felt, well, we'll go. We'll take our extra country cottage and go. And I mean, it was difficult to blame them at that time. Picked them out and singled them out and left a weak, despondent organization. He went in particular for the weakest people. The weakest people always he humiliated. There's a passage in Roy Greenslade's book which I commend to you about how all the executives were sitting around there. It's too long to read out, unfortunately, but how all the executives were sitting around there one day and a secretary came in. And how he deliberately, there's about a 1.5-page description of it, in front of those executives, humiliated that secretary, asked her if she knew who his Israeli contact was, who the Israeli ambassador in London was, and when she said she didn't know, humiliated her, shouted her, told her she was simply unable to do the job. Now that sort of thing was going on all the time. I recall the editors, the city officer, the city editor's secretary, being rung up by Maxwell saying to fax something to some other organization, and she said she couldn't find it, and he sent down 3 people to take her out of the building and sack her on the spot. He had his sort of clones of dogs that operated out through what he called his human resources group, needless to say, a human resources organization, who would go and take people out of the building and sack them on the spot, and then he would broadcast that he would sack them on the spot. The city editor was going off the next week, so he didn't do anything, so that was another secretary humiliated. Angela Malloy, who was the mother of the Sogat Clerical Chapel, she was sacked for putting a notice on the board. The Sogat didn't respond. Nobody really responded. They said, oh, well, we'll go to an industrial tribunal, and they even lost at the industrial tribunal. And so he broke the unions, he broke the confidence, he broke the spirit of collectivity. He did it with subtlety, with brutality, with by merging his awful mixture of sort of greasy charm and savage ruthlessness. By merging those two, he destroyed the unions utterly. And what you had was a series of opposites which is really impossible to describe. A man who had said all the time that he was there, he was the subject of vendettas, that people were out to get him, that he was the subject of vendettas, carried out vendettas of the most fantastic ferocity against anybody who had criticized him or who stood in his way, both inside and outside the building. His vendetta against Tom Bauer, who wrote the book about him, which is not actually a tremendously critical book, but his vendetta against them, 13 different writs in 14 different countries, all over the world. He persecuted Bauer, and he persecuted everyone. A man who said that he was interested in the trade unions, utterly hostile to the trade unions. A man who pretended, and on the very few occasions that I met him, I remember him saying, the trouble with you, Paul, is you don't really believe I'm a socialist, as he said. A man who said he's a socialist, who's kind of rocked back in horror at the very use of that word, that he could use this word. You can't believe that he said such a thing, but it constantly said, I'm a socialist at heart, I'm a manager, socialists have got to have manager, was in fact a Tory of the most revolting persuasion. Not just that all his friends were Tories, that all his policies were Tories, that actually all the important policies of the Tories he supported, even in the newspapers which were meant to be supporting the Labour Party, but that the Tories recognised in him a friend. I have a story, Julia Langdon, who was a journalist who worked for the Guardian, a political correspondent of the Guardian, and wrote some quite good stuff, reasonable stuff in the Guardian, member of CND, left Labour and so on, or middle left Labour, or whether these terms mean anything nowadays, I don't know. But at any rate, she was somebody with some kind of radical persuasion, and she was writing quite well in The Guardian, and they persuaded her to become political correspondent of the Daily Mirror, working under Joe Haynes, and she went to Thatcher, and there was a Thatcher press conference, and Thatcher beckoned her over after the press conference. Julia, I hear you're going to the Daily Mirror. A very good decision. Then she said, a dose of Maxwell will do you the world of good. Now, she knew exactly what Maxwell was doing there. And of course, a dose of Maxwell did do Julia a lot of good, according to Thatcher. Namely, that it made her write more and more reactionary material under the hammer of Maxwell on every single occasion, so that she only lasted a few months, and then she went off to the Sunday Telegraph to become the political correspondent, suitably changed in her attitudes and in her ideas of defiance. So what I want to say is this, that obvious, that the Thatcher age, the age of Thatcher, the 80s and so on, are normally described in the newspapers and by its supporters as an age of great entrepreneurs, dynamic and thrusting innovators, people who suddenly could throw off the shackles of bureaucracy, nationalisation, public ownership, the clawing attentions of trade unions, and could apply all their brilliance and their innovativeness, or whatever the word is, could apply all these wonderful things freely, and therefore inventions and all new ideas kept flowing forth in the period of the 1980s. People were saying that at the time, weren't they, about the 1980s, and a few, much less people, say that nowadays. In fact, what the age of Thatcher was an age of union busters, an age of greedy swindlers, monsters and crooks, of whom Maxwell was perhaps the most obvious and revolting representative. Now, the problem for people like Maxwell is that they have to grapple with the difficulty about immortality. You see, they become so great, so important, so powerful. They surround themselves by people who tell them all the time how important and powerful they are, that they begin to question They really begin to worry about the question of immortality. The evidence appears to be that everybody dies. It stares you in the face, doesn't it? I mean, even Maxwell, confronted by that evidence, had plenty. But then he was so great, wasn't he? He was such a big man that maybe there was some doubt in his case. However, he'd better get on with it. He was 61 when he took over the Daily Mirror, and by the end of the 1980s came to a close, he had a huge empire, but he wanted to be king over the world. And so he started buying. Like a complete nutter and lunatic, he started buying. He bought Macmillan's, the biggest publishing company in the United States, at a price which anyone could have told him was absolutely unrealistic, even with interest rates at the level they were in the end of 1988, 1989. He bought Macmillan's and started to buy. Every week he'd be, fortunately for us, in Portugal, in Argentina, in South Africa, in Israel, buying up newspapers and buying up publishing houses. He believed that he wanted to be king of the world. But of course the system which had promoted him, in the end did him down, because the system that had promoted him could not guarantee to him the low interest rates that he required in order to be able to survive. The interest rates went up, the borrowings became intolerable, the banks which had supported his purchase of Macmillan, had supported this lunatic king-making operation that had gone on, started to pull the plug. And in the end he was faced with a very straight choice. It was a choice between Wormwood Scrubs and the Mount of Olives. If he'd gone on another week, then he would have been in prison, certainly. Possibility of him dying and being buried in the Mount of Olives was nice to him. It might test the question of immortality. And at any rate, perhaps he could walk upon the water, which is no doubt exactly what he tried to do. I just want to end up very briefly. I just want to end up perhaps with a question which perhaps is on a lot of your lips, and the purpose, no doubt, of calling me to this meeting today, which is this business of working with Maxwell. I mean, when I came to work on working for Maxwell, rather, when I came to work on the Daily Mirror, I was extremely fortunate in that I had a free space. I mean, for an openly, I'd left the Socialist Worker 6 months earlier, so I don't think there was any doubt in anyone's mind what my politics were. To be given the free space, the open space, which I could choose myself what items I should cover, as long as they were news items and informative items, was, of course, a tremendous advantage. And it's true, and I can claim that Maxwell never touched my page. He didn't, and I can, that's a claim that I can make, but I think it is a hollow claim if what that claim is trying to prove is some sort of image, which is an image which exists very deeply in the minds of people who profess and boast about the capitalist system, the image of a fearless campaigner, the fearless campaigning investigative journalist. That's someone that everybody loves, don't they? Oh, you're a fearless campaigning investigative journalist? Yes, I'm really glad to meet you. This man's really fearless, he really stands up, and publishes things, and he's really fearless. Now, this is a complete mirage, this idea of the fearless investigative reporter. It's a mirage of a society which likes to believe that it provides a free press. And it's a very simple reason why it's a mirage, and that is because the press is owned by the same people who own the whole of the society, that the press is part of the whole society, it reflects the whole of society, it reflects the ideas, the prevailing ideas in the society, and those, of course, are the ideas of the ruling class. And therefore, the newspapers are part of them. And the one thing, however fearless and investigative, however free your space is, however much Maxwell doesn't touch a page, the one thing you can't do in that newspaper is to attack Maxwell. And that may seem a small thing. I mean, it is, I think, a small thing to say you can't attack Maxwell, you can attack everything else. That's one way of looking at it. But as Maxwell gets more powerful, more disgusting, more revolting, as his influence stretches not only through the newspaper but through the whole society, like a great piece of dirty shit smelling the whole society out, so it becomes, the shit attaches, if you like, to all those that are associated with him in any way at all. And because you can't, in a sense, criticize him in their own newspapers, that is a limitation. That is a limitation. It knocks out the notion of the fearless investigative reporter. It limits them and restricts them in such a way that there no such creature can in fact exist. And of course, if you see Maxwell, and this is the important point, as an exception to the rule, if you see him as grosser in essence, not just in degree, but grosser in essence, a quite different character than any of the others that are in his business, then of course there's an obvious answer to anyone who works for him, any journalist with their own ideas who works for him, and that is to go and try their hand at the others that are operating in a much freer and different way. Like it did speak to me at the time, and certainly seems to everyone else that I spoke to and asked advice about this question. Much better, if you're working for someone as a worker, to resist than to resign. Useless to resign, that's more pleasant in many ways, but useless, purposeful to resist. And therefore I'm quite happy with, I'm just ending on this, I'm quite happy with the caricature which says that here's the investigative reporter who doesn't notice that hundreds of millions of pounds are being taken out of his own office, outside his own office, doesn't notice, it, can't report it. I'm quite happy with that caricature, because it is a caricature of the society in which we live. It throws up the contradictions of the society in which we live. I would be much less happy if anyone were to say to me, well, this man ducked the opposition to the redundancies. This man did not go and support the Pergamon strikers because Maxwell controlled Pergamon. This man did not support Scargill against the witch hunt that operated him publicly, that is, not just privately, but publicly in whatever way I could. If anyone said that of me, then I should feel ashamed. I'm quite happy with the contradiction of being the investigative reporter that can't investigate, because that's the world we live in. But I wouldn't have been happy if I hadn't been able to oppose him in all those other ways. Just one very last point, and that is this. That people say that society has changed. They say that the world we live in has changed. That, and one of the ways they say it is that the old-style capitalists, the idea of the old, fat, ignorant, boorish, ruthless capitalist who exploits his workers above all else has gone. That idea is gone. That's what people say. I present to those people the great man of the 1980s, Robert Maxwell. And I thought really that what we ought to do, although I'm very, very nervous about it, more nervous about this than anything else, I thought we ought to sing, if you've got this, just as a tribute to Robert Maxwell, I thought we ought to sing this little ditty. Now, I don't know, I'd like to call people up to sing, because I'm a rotten singer, and I don't really get the tune very well. Can anyone here really sing? I mean, anybody here want to come up and use the microphone so that I don't have it? But I've got the music if anyone wants to. Right, no, he's no use. Anybody? I've got the music. I think it goes something like this. Last time I did this, I was really bollocked, you know. Pat Stack and people bollocked me and say, oh, we didn't get the words. Right, you've got the words now, so I don't want any excuse. I think it goes like this, and it is about Maxwell from start to finish. We don't have to sing it all, but we can at least sing the chorus. Let's see if we can sing the chorus. And if you can sing the chorus properly, we might sing it all. I think it goes a bit like this. I'm the man, the very fat man that waters the workers' beer. Yes, I'm the man, the very fat man that waters the workers' beer. Oh, what do I care if it makes them ill or it makes them terribly queer? I've a car, a yacht and an aeroplane, and I waters the workers' beer. Not bad. I think that'll do though, comrades. Thank you very much.